Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a Gameweek 8 draft wildcard. So we're a couple of weeks off my own personal wildcard, but I think the beauty of the Gameweek 8 draft wildcard is it has allowed a lot of people to dead end certain fixtures. You now sit at an international break with a lot of information, more information truly to speak about the Premier League team so far and how they've performed and how you feel about certain assets. I do still think that, the point to make at a Gameweek 8 wildcard is your understanding of the rest of the season is not going to be concrete by just looking at the last 7 games. Things will change, and of course we have expectations of teams that are built upon previous understandings of them, not just their performance this season. As far as what I find interesting about the Gameweek 8 draft wildcard, I think it's fundamentally the structure. I think to even get started on it, it's almost a question first of how you approach, let's say, Salah's significant dip in terms of performance within the wider context of how Liverpool play and how they sort of support him and how he's, I think, lacked the same sort of tools needed for him to perform, maybe compared to previous seasons. And equally, when you look at a game like Chelsea as well and watch his performance there, individually, of course, he's not at that sort of level or peak as we saw last season. And then you have, on the flip side of the coin, Haaland, who probably looks the best he's ever been. So I think even from a fixtures point of view, even though I am a fixtures person and someone who likes to look at odds, I think we can see, of course, that the odds are moving away from Salah. But the question is how much and for how long? Because for me, I think structurally on a Gameweek 8 wildcard, what would be quite interesting, if you can afford it, is a Haaland plus Salah draft. But it also seems like if you don't have the opportunity to do it, that just purely going for Haaland only, from a risk perspective, I think still makes sense because you're betting on the horse that everyone else has. And on top of that, you're not putting yourself in a position where I think you're maybe hurt by the still very expensive Salah price, right? If you go for Haaland plus Salah or Salah only, you're taking on an excessive amount of risk, or you are owning Haaland as well, maximizing captaincies on paper, but then maybe having a team that doesn't really feel that rounded, especially when you want to still have Arsenal players in your team. So I will be presenting my draft, of course, that I like the most now, and I'll kind of walk through the discussions and how I get towards that conclusion. But if you want to have a third-party view on it, have a look at the link in the description below. Have a look at Fantasy Football Hub's AI rating tool. They will have suggested wildcards for you. They will have the opportunity to even rate your wildcards. If you have a different view on the wildcards, you want to have a look at different players, you disagree with my wildcard, that's fine. Have a look at the link in the description below. See what actually the AI recommends and have a third-party opinion from a model. So from my perspective, I think if I was to build a wildcard, the easiest way that I would go about it is that I'd kind of look at the fixtures first, starting from this run, and then think about structurally what I want to do. As I said, I think from a starting point of view, you need to answer the question of how you want to go about Haaland plus Salah. Now, most people I actually already asked a Twitter poll on, I think are comfortable just going Haaland only, right? It just feels right in terms of what you've seen so far, in terms of how we might have to reevaluate Salah. I'd also like to put a very interesting tweet that was put out recently that I did retweet from Ted Knutson. So this is the founder of StatsBomb, showing Salah's latest stats this season in terms of his radar charts as a player. And I think it is concerning, right? I think it's fair to say that this is potentially the worst that we've ever seen Salah. And it's okay to accept that, right? This is a player who now, from a percentile terms, like when you're comparing across the league, is maybe below average or just average for what you'd expect from a Liverpool attacker who's absolutely nailed, right? Much less shots per game. This is almost half of last season. When you look at things like open play XG, when you look at things like touches in the box, that's all gone down from last season. And the percentiles, I think, make that clear. Salah, for the most part of his career within Liverpool, has always been a 90 to 100% percentile player, right? He is nowhere near that. He is somewhere lounging in the middle. And I think Soli also presented a quite a good analysis before even the match versus Chelsea, which I think was his best game so far in terms of if you want to talk about, is Salah the type of person who this Liverpool team creates chances for? Sure, he did in those Chelsea games or in that Chelsea match. But an overall context, including the Chelsea game this season, just suggests, I think, that we're not getting the numbers that we really want to see from Salah. So from even that perspective, I think the risk you're taking on is quite considerable if you go for Salah. So I will go for a Haaland only draw. So that's almost my approach, because the first question I like to ask is captaincy. And I still think, even though maybe Salah on paper could be better for captaincies when you factor in he's a midfielder, yada, 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 the reality is I think Haaland is right there. I wouldn't quite take the chance against it. Then the next question is on fixtures. Easiest way we do that is using 11high.com's match week predictions and just having a look at his team predictions for goals and clean sheets, looking at the 6 weeks ahead. So from a goals perspective, once again, Liverpool is top, no surprise. But it goes back to that point of, do I really like any of the Liverpool attackers? I would still say at this moment in time, no. What concerns me, I think, when I look at someone like Isak is still the minutes. When I look at Gakpo, I think you can say the same question, even though he played 90 minutes versus Chelsea. And maybe he could still be quite good. But I think the concern still is, I'm not quite sure if they have everything fit together. And, is there an opportunity for someone like Gakpo to be rotated in and out of games? And therefore you have concerns. And, from a narrative standpoint, maybe the double Wirtz benchings help in terms of, finding some sort of direction in terms of where Gakpo's minutes are. But I think it can easily happen to him as well. And we can see slot change the structure. As far as, let's say, the next few teams to target, I think with City, just having Haaland alone is enough. With Arsenal, the biggest question here is how you approach triple Arsenal. Now, last week when I suggested a wildcard draft, I went for Saka Gyökeres. I think that given that the West Ham at home fixture is actually gone, which is actually one of their best attacking games in the run, now I'd probably switch back to double Arsenal defense. So when I look at something like this, I don't think Arsenal are amazing in terms of offense, but do I want to keep one Arsenal attacker? Yeah, and that attacker is going to be Saka. Eze as well as a consideration on the wild card, but I think that question of would you go Eze or would you go for someone like Yuri and Timber, I think is open up, to your sort of point of view. But I'd still always rather back the Arsenal defense because in terms of where the team strength sort of tilts, I would always go with Arsenal. And we'll talk about this in the What We've Learned series as well when we do that within the international break. As far as Chelsea, they actually have one of the best fixture runs. I think when you kind of price evaluate these fixtures compared to the quality and the price of the assets, Chelsea have the best run, right? Chelsea have players like Enzo, players like João Pedro, still, right? We'll talk about João Pedro in a moment, but that are worth these price points. And with Brighton next, I would heavily consider Mente and call it a day there. With Crystal Palace, I'd probably just go Sarr. I own Mateta right now. I'm not a super fond Mateta owner. I'll probably have to reluctantly hold him. But apart from Game Week 9, they just have an exceptional run of games. I mean, maybe doubling up could make sense, but I think I'd still just simply go for Sarr because I think he's just an astoundingly good player. And you're already starting to see Mateta's minutes get hurt. With Newcastle, I would like to point out that I think Waltemad's the most interesting pick for now, just because the forwards, I think, are much weaker in comparison to, let's say, what competing midfielders can do versus Gordon. And therefore, Waltemad looks interesting. But I'm not sure I'm that sold on him as a pick, just because I feel like some of the other forwards just have better games. And I do think Newcastle have a strong run of games, but not necessarily the best. Now, there's obviously Bowen, there's other players in terms of the forward positions that are interesting. I think within Bournemouth, you've got Evan Nilsson as well. Am I that intrigued by an Evan Nilsson or Waltemad? Probably not. I do think the Wisa injury helps a lot. So if you want to go for Newcastle and Waltemad, I think that's perfectly fine, right? And especially if you don't care about João Pedro. Another thing you need to consider is when you're going to free hit, right? Because if you take one of the fixtures off of this calendar, you might reevaluate exactly how you want to approach your players in your team. For now, though, I'm going to suggest a bit more of a free hit agnostic play. And I think you can also approach maybe free hit 13 quite heavily with a wildcard 8. Because if you stack heavily into Chelsea, you don't really care about that bad Game Week 13 match. And actually, you've got a really, really good team going forwards that will have a lot of Chelsea players, which for the most part, I still think are one of the best priced teams within the game. With Bournemouth, I still think I'd just go for Semenyo now. I think if you haven't owned Senesi up until this point, there's a good case to maybe drop Senesi from the draft. And all the other teams from this point on, I don't think I'm that intrigued by, including Everton as well from a goals perspective. As far as clean sheets, though, if we just shift gears, what are the big changes? I would say Chelsea's a little bit higher on this list. City, we probably weren't buying for clean sheets anyways. With Liverpool, I think you need to kind of consider whether their defenders do DEFCON, because I think that's a consideration as well with Chelsea. With Newcastle, it's still very, very strong. And Dan Burn is still around, of course. But I think Fulham is the interesting piece here, where if you go back to that argument of a couple of weeks ago with, who's the best 4.5? Is it Anderson? Is it Senesi? I kind of think Anderson could be better for this run. So Anderson is probably, the most interesting player from that 4.5 price range. Otherwise, Crystal Palace is still very, very resolute, very, very strong. And of course, the value to them is DEFCON, which you can't necessarily see here in the clean sheets metric. But those are the teams that I'd probably be looking at from a defensive point of view. Maybe Sunderland as well, because from all the sort of cheap teams where you have 4.0 players or even Leeds, those are the teams where I'd say they have generally some good games there. Probably more so Leeds, but I think if you're thinking about just rotation, you're just thinking, what are the best matches I can play a 4.0 in? It probably is a Leeds defender. But the big question, as I said, is are you actually going to play them? So maybe actually a Leeds defender is still the one to go for at 4.0. But Sunderland have also done a lot of DEFCONs with Mukiele and Alderete, so maybe there's some value to that. If we now shift towards wildcard draft, how am I building out this team? Now, I've built this team first from midfield, then defense, then forwards, and then sort of reevaluate it. But I think if we just start from defense, right, and just kind of talk about what I want to see from a defense on this wildcard, I think that I'm okay with dropping Raya on the wildcard. I think at 5.7, if you haven't bought into Raya, you don't really need Raya at this point in time. I think Sanchez and Pope are still wonderful. Now, I have just mentioned Sanchez, and I'm sure a lot of people actually are looking to wildcard off of Sanchez and maybe go into Pope. But Sanchez is about to enter an absolutely great run of games. And my first preference would actually be to go for Sanchez, but I have opted to go triple Chelsea in a different direction. So that's why I'm going with Nick Pope for this point in time. I think he's a Nick's best 5.0. And then we go with Dubravka here, who somewhat covers Pope, for example, for even this match, right? Where in game week 8, when you're actually wildcarding, you probably aren't going to go Pope over Dubravka. I would play Dubravka in this match. So that's going to be the goalkeeping pair. In the defense, I think the big gamble here is Yuri and Timber. If we just show the defense now, Alaba is the defender I'm going with, Gabriel as well, Anderson and Rodon. Now, this week specifically, I would play Rodon and the double Arsenal defense, but I can also see the sort of point in just playing Chalobah as well. I like Chalobah for this run ahead. I just think he has shown that this season he's been, first of all, set piece strat. Second of all, actually very good for DEFCON. So Chelsea's DEFCON is slightly upticked, and that could be a long-term trend, or it's actually maybe more of a reflection of actually within the league. I think team DEFCON has actually gone up a little bit. So you're starting to see, for example, from some of the top teams, slightly higher DEFCON percentages and even points. So, for example, what's a good test of this? Gabriel doing really, really well. Chalobah, Chelsea defenders like Tosin as well, and Virgil, even Konate, have all sort of upped their sort of metrics. And part of this, as I said, I think is maybe the long throw meta that we're seeing within the league. And I think maybe a closet theory that players actually know about DEFCON. No, I'm just kidding. But if we go towards the Arsenal defense, I think the reason why we're taking the gamble on Yuri and Timber is I still think that for the most part, Arsenal are playing in a situation where almost every game is worth something. If you have a strong enough defense, I would imagine that White can play out a match. And I think that if I was to bet over the next 10 games, I would say that Timber is probably still going to start at least 9 games within the Premier League. I could be wrong on this, but I think that's just the sort of level that Timber is playing at, where White just really has struggled to get minutes. And the kind of matches that you're seeing White play are matches like, for example, Olympiacos at home, where still when you look at maybe some of the Champions League run of games, I think that's where you'll probably see White play, or an EFL Cup match, right? So I would still be quite confident in Timber. Now, if you're not so confident in Timber, I think there's a consideration to simply actually just going Virgil if you want to, or going Saliba, right? If you really back the clean sheets and you really back Arsenal's defense, I don't really mind just simply moving Timber towards Saliba. I think you get similar value when you consider the potential 1 benching out of 10 that Timber's likely to have. As far as Gabriel, I think he's just nailed in the draft. There's not much to be said. I imagine anyone who's wildcarded has brought Gabriel before he's 6.3. So in that sort of 6.1, 6.2 price point, he's fantastic, right? There's no other discussion. Because of the price rises, which I'm anticipating, right? I think this will hurt people who don't own Senesi. I am, as I said, suggesting Chalobah, who I think is going to be nailed for the foreseeable for Chelsea, just given the plenty of injuries and what those impacts are for someone like Chalobah in his position. I would go Anderson and Rodon as well. Now, Rodon is, for me, someone who you could easily play in Game Week 8, but has shown so far that he's once again, another set-piece threat, and really good at DEFCON as well, when you could benchmark against even some of the Sunderland defenders who've probably done a little bit better than him. And I think Leeds are still the better team from a defensive point of view. So if you're thinking about going for a long-term pick, I kind of like the Leeds player over the Sunderland player. As far as Anderson at 4.5, I'm surprised he's at 4.5. It might be because everyone started the game with Anderson in terms of people who are very engaged, and maybe that's why his ownership hasn't gone up too much. He might be boring. Fulham might still not be getting enough clean sheets, but he is still, vaguely a set-piece threat. He is still someone who can, in a good game condition, get the sort of bonus metrics because he passes so much, and also just is a much better DEFCONer than anyone else in that centre-back position for that sort of quality of team and defense. So that's kind of my defense. In the midfield, if we shift over to that, I think I would still go Semenyo on the wild card. Now, I think, once again, we always talk about this concept of risk in FPL, where you look at someone like Semenyo, and if you're someone who, let's say, hasn't owned Semenyo up until this point, I think there's a genuine consideration of, if you haven't owned all these price rises, if you don't have team value associated with Semenyo, maybe you can consider going without Semenyo. Now, I'm sure a lot of people have views on this, and looking at someone who's basically overperformed the most in the game, and thinking that, You can't let go of someone on a hot streak. And I think to an extent there's a point there. But also I think if you've sort of missed out on all the returns and you're now looking at the run of games that Bournemouth have, I mean, there's a pretty deliberate reason why we haven't gone for someone like Senesi. Also a pretty deliberate reason why I don't think Semenyo is essential in this draft. I've recommended Semenyo every week since wildcard 4, and I personally think that this is a decent run where you can consider going without Semenyo. So if you do want to go without Semenyo, I think you're opening yourself up to options like maybe an Eze, right? And maybe switching how you approach Arsenal. Maybe just going for Gordon if you still trust the minutes, which can definitely be a bit of a yo-yo. You can see, for example, him playing 90 minutes in Champions League matches, and then maybe 60 minutes in the league, which isn't good enough. As far as Saka, I think he's just nailed in the draft. If you're going to ignore Salah, which I think I would, keep in mind that this draft budget I've deliberately kind of made with like 2 million in the bank within my own team, because I know I've taken a lot of team value and price rises, and I'm sure a lot of people, you know, aren't in the same position if they're on a Game Week 8 wildcard, right? That's part of the reason why I've created the draft that's a little bit lower on budget. But I also think that the macro point from a Game Week 8 wildcard is actually that you don't really need that much money, I think, to create the best team right now in FPL. If you're going to ignore Salah, you're going to have Haaland, fine. You're most likely going to ignore Bruno as well, especially to onboard someone on a Liverpool game. To me, it's kind of similar to onboarding some of the Newcastle players, where you're onboarding them on Brighton away, which I don't really particularly like. And then Newcastle actually don't have that astoundingly good a run, right? If anything, as I said last week in the cheat sheet, that best Newcastle game is the Nottingham Forest at home match, not any of the games after. So when I kind of look at, you know, even Semenyo here to an extent, this is a pretty poor run, so you can ignore him. But it is a risk profile things where I think if you're comfortable with where you're at, you don't really want to deal with that sort of 80% EO, 85% EO type player. No, don't go Semenyo. But, you know, that is up to your risk profile. As I said, there are some alternative options, but my concern is that those options don't necessarily provide you the same value because they don't play the same amount of minutes of Semenyo. And so even though Semenyo has worse games, the reality is he's a 95-minute footballer compared to some of the other players who, you know, might turn up for 60 minutes and actually have a slightly better run just about. So that's kind of why I still think Semenyo is quite an easy and obvious play. Same argument goes for Saka, where, of course, the minutes are much reduced and much less pronounced. But in a world where it seems like he is still, vaguely speaking, the penalty decision maker, I think he gave a quote about how he'll keep the decisions in-house. But the reason why he took the penalty was because in that moment, he decided he wanted to take it. So to me, it seems like he's a bit of a decision maker now in terms of penalties. I would easily just go with double Arsenal defense and Saka now that we have a bit more clarity on the situation. I think Saka only is vaguely how I think the penalties will go this season, with Gyökeres having the chance to take some of them, and he probably deserves a pity penalty, right? I know I need one. As far as Enzo, I think he's a lock. When you actually look at some of the underlying stats of the season, and we'll once again cover this within the What We've Learned videos, Enzo actually comes up top in some of the combined MPXG numbers, so that's really, really impressive so far, and he's about to embark on his best run of games. The only sort of slight con with Enzo this time around is he is coming back from international break. You know, he might have slight reduced minutes. I'm not sure if that's the case because the last time around he actually played 90 minutes anyways, and he's just someone who hasn't been exceptional, I think, on the pitch for Chelsea, but I think is very much trusted by the manager. You have no fears with regards to minutes. And I once again have to point to that situation of, I do really think that Palmer seems like he actually has an injury that's quite serious that I don't think means he'll be coming back in 2 to 3 weeks time. I could be completely wrong, but let's find out what happens with the Chelsea thing. That just makes Enzo, you know, either a sell within the medium term or actually just a long-term hold. So I think he's a lock on the draft. With Minte and Sarr, I think these are the two other exciting picks where if you think about players who are breaking out once again this season and players who have posted amazing numbers underlying stats wise and play for a really solid team still, Brighton and Crystal Palace are still those teams, and Minte and Sarr are exactly those players. For me, they're once again absolute locks on this draft. I just think they're the most exciting players that you can get that are guaranteed really, really good minutes for their teams. And going back to the argument of, if you kind of look at the forward position and how boring the forward position is, I'd much rather spend money within the midfield position and actually have a 5 midfield stack, ironically because stack isn't in it. So that's kind of how I would approach it. I would have 5 midfielders before I go for something like, 3 solid forwards. If anything, I think some of the forwards can be either a Gu at times or even just like a Dominic Calvert-Lewin, who I think is, one of the safest budget picks within the game that we still have. So that kind of leads us towards the forward position where we have João Pedro, Haaland, and Calvert-Lewin. Now, I'm not someone who actually frequently recommends João Pedro too much on wildcards because, of course, the ownership has been skyrocketing and now it's obviously starting to crater a little bit because he's not performed well. The biggest thing for me is he will get this rest. I think that is guaranteed. You have the international break where he's resting. You also have the Champions League where he's resting from. So his minutes most likely are going to lie within the Premier League. And to bank on this Chelsea fixture run, I think I'd still own João Pedro. I think I'd still own João Pedro over Bowen for this moment in time, just for the next 4 to 5 fixtures. I'm not saying that João Pedro is now going to be a hold long term, but if you're thinking about, let's say, the forward position being the most fragile within the game, right? For me, it's the most boring position in the game. I think it probably is the least price efficient position in the game. I probably want to spend as little money in the forwards as possible. So for me, João Pedro kind of satisfies everything, where if you're just thinking about maximizing the short term, at least you can bank on those Chelsea games. There's not really even one game other than Gameweek 13, as I mentioned, that kind of hurts to own Chelsea players for. So just take advantage of that run and go for triple Chelsea here. Now, the big sort of con, I suppose, of this draft is that you don't have an easy, flexible way of going for Cole Palmer if it is almost the case that Cole Palmer is coming back to the game very, very quickly, right? You can't do, for example, Saka to Cole Palmer one move. Now, if you don't want to do that, I think the simple answer is just to go Chalobah back to Senesi. And just don't go triple Chelsea within this way. You can, of course, also go Jared Bowen over João Pedro, right? So if you're thinking about that in mind and you're generally worried that Palmer's going to come back in 2 to 3 weeks' time, I think there is some value and some utility in just simply going for double Chelsea. So that's something to think about if you're actually thinking about the Gameweek 8 draft wildcard and structurally how you want to set up, right? Whereas with Arsenal, I think because you kind of already know, like, everyone's a known quantity, to so to speak. I think Timber, Gabriel, and Saka is still the best way to go about it. Whereas with Palmer, I'm kind of laying my claim here that I don't think we'll see him back to football anytime soon. So that's kind of my take. As far as Haaland and Calvert-Lewin, I feel like these are just obvious picks. A lot of people will question Calvert-Lewin. Obviously, I mean, like, anytime I put Calvert-Lewin in a draft or mention Calvert-Lewin in a video, I get questioned in the comments, and I think that's fair enough. But the reality is, a lot of the forwards in the game are just boring. He is one of the cheapest players in the game who actually plays 90 minutes every single match. And if you want someone who saves you even more money, you know, you do have Foster, right, for Burnley, because I'm sure he's so much more exciting than Dominic Calvert-Lewin missing chances. But yeah, that's going to be Calvert-Lewin. I just think nailed, most likely the penalty taker. If I take the logic of Emeka taking the penalty, I think in game week 1, and I think Strike was on the pitch as well, it's more than likely Calvert-Lewin's just going to take penalties. You know, he could miss the penalty, sure. Another big chance missed is what he's looking for. But I think that's kind of the value of DCL, right? This is someone who is your 8th option on the team. Right now, the game, I don't see actually needing that much value. Like, when I look at some of the midfielders that I actually own right now, I probably would actually prefer owning Minte and Sarr than Gordon. I'd probably actually feel the same about them versus maybe even Eze to an extent. In the context that I actually own triple Arsenal in a different direction, right? So that's all I'm saying there. So this is going to be the Game Week 8 draft wildcard. This is how I'd set up in terms of, you know, actually playing it this week. I would go Dubravka in goal versus Leeds at home. I'd play double Arsenal defense and then play Rodon, and then actually have Chalobah first bench. In the midfield, I'd go with all the midfielders. In the forward positions, I would just go with João Pedro and Haaland and have Calvert-Lewin. Well, I'd probably have Calvert-Lewin first bench and then Chalobah second bench. And then third bench would be Anderson this week versus Arsenal. But that's going to be it for the Game Week 8 draft wildcard. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys the best of luck with the wildcard. And do look out for the What We've Learned videos, where we're going to recap some of the stats from the season, how I feel about certain teams, how I feel about certain players as well, and how they've performed so far compared to sort of the point score metrics within the game. So thank you guys. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.